Little by little, we are starting to learn what will happen next in Chapter 5 of Poppy Playtime, particularly about new characters. The developers have left us some hints so we can discover who we will meet. We were sent a very interesting image, where on the side we can see both monsters we already know and some new ones we are encountering for the first time. These might be the ones we'll face in Chapter 5. Could it be that the developers deliberately left this Easter egg for us and that everything is almost ready? So, we don't have complete models of the new characters yet, but we do have something even better. Drawings of the new characters. The image in front of us is from the same room we were in during Chapter 4, filled with buttons, levers, and chairs. But that's not the main thing we're interested in. What matters is what's on the side, the drawings of various monsters. It's hard to make everything out clearly, but I think you might recognize some of them. There's our iconic Huggy Wuggy, the caterpillar dog from Chapter 2, even if it's just a small reference, and 3 smiling creatures, Biba Bibafent, the little dog day, and the little catnap. After that, we see some monsters we haven't met yet, but if we look closely, we can spot another monster, Daisy. Daisy, the flower, who hasn't appeared in any chapter yet, but we do know her. In fact, this character was initially planned to be a separate monster in Chapter 2, replacing Bonzo Bunny. According to the story, Daisy was a rejected toy that made children scared and cry. Apparently the kids didn't like the flower. However, the monster was supposed to be an antagonist, and the real reasons for its rejection are unknown. But Daisy isn't forgotten, and it feels like they want to hint at her return, possibly in the form of a small flower. Maybe they didn't make Daisy a full-fledged mascot, but there are analogs of this toy, and they could have been used for experiments, as small toys were always part of them. And, to the joy of the fans, Daisy could return. I'm not too sure she'll appear in Chapter 5, but I do expect something like a reference or an Easter egg, or maybe even a full-fledged character. Even if it's a secondary character, I think many would be happy to see Daisy in some form, as long as she's alive. We also have a big blue monster, and it looks very similar to Doughy. However, Doughy doesn't have red or pink arms, and the head is different from the one in the drawing. This character has what looks like small horns or a hat, while Doughy has a bald, flat head with a small hat. But to be fair, the head here is hard to make out, and although it doesn't look much like Doughy, we know about a character who was cut. It's very possible that the drawing shows that very clown from an image we saw long before Chapter 4 came out. It's possible that the clown was just a prototype for Doughy. Originally, they could have planned a clown, but then made Doughy instead. However, we know that Doughy was planned as an antagonist as early as Chapter 2. The clown could have been drawn and conceived earlier, but then why was that image released as an Easter egg? Doughy behaves accordingly, but a clown doesn't equal Doughy, and the clown is already known. His name is Jolly, the cheerful clown, who is also a bit chubby. In all the images, he has gloves, and they tried to depict him with different hairstyles and hats. It seems that the artists and developers have come to a consensus about how the antagonist might look. This could even be the main antagonist in Chapter 5. By the way, we were expecting him in Chapter 4, but this is an even more interesting drawing where, if I'm not mistaken, we can see Killy Willy. Wow, Killy Willy, but I don't think this is canon. It's most likely just an Easter egg because Killy Willy is a fan-made character. However, I wouldn't be surprised if, in Chapter 5, they leave an Easter egg showing that this version of Huggy Wuggy was planned at the factory. Or they might even add him as a separate character, since we've already seen a long-legged Papa as an Easter egg. We've also seen something similar in the game itself, like the appearance of nightmare creatures that weren't planned before the development of Chapter 4, sort of a Halloween version. So why not repeat something like this here, a Halloween Huggy Wuggy? Why not? Especially since in another project by the same developers, Project Playtime, he already exists as a skin for Huggy Wuggy, so Killy Willy could definitely appear in Chapter 5. And just when you think that this questionable Easter egg is all there is to it, it turns out that it's not. Let's think about it. Who else could we see making an appearance in Chapter 5? Of course, we've got our old familiar characters, or maybe even some not-so-friendly ones. These could be the ones that we haven't had the chance to see yet. If we take into account what we've seen with the Boogie Bots so far, it's pretty clear that they haven't completely forgotten about our old favorites, and it seems like they're still figuring out exactly how to fit them into these chapters. I have a feeling that if they don't appear in Chapter 5, they'll likely create a special Chapter 6 just to include every character. And when I say that, of course, I'm talking about characters like Catbee, who is the hybrid of a cat and a bee. What's especially interesting is that she was actually planned to be a fully developed monster in Chapter 3, but at the time, they intended for her to be one of the smiling creatures. However, for reasons unknown, they ultimately decided that she was unnecessary for the storyline. Another monster that belongs to the cat family is Candy Cat, who is also a fully fleshed out experiment known as Subject Number 106. As a side note, there is a document in Chapter 2 where the testing of Candy Cat's abilities is outlined. This would mean that she should at least make an appearance as a secondary character, even if it's just for a few seconds, much like how Pianosaurus appeared. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to happen, but it's worth noting that Candy Cat actually has a complete backstory, which isn't something that every monster in this universe can claim. Moving on to another character, we have the dinosaur Brawn, who also has an assigned experiment number 1199. The subject of his experiment was someone named Thomas Clark. In fact, we even got a chance to see a full video detailing this experiment. The developers are still in the process of figuring out where they can fit Brawn into the story. Additionally, if you recall the trailer for Chapter 1, we actually saw a live version of Brawn, but he hasn't made an appearance in the game yet. That said, it's entirely possible that we will see him at some point in the future. I'm not ruling out a cameo appearance for Boxy Boo, either. While he may not be a full-fledged monster, I believe he could at least get as much screen time as Pianosaurus did. Unlike Pianosaurus, Boxy Boo does actually feature some gameplay in Project Playtime, and it's possible that Boxy Boo could make a brief appearance, maybe for around 5 seconds, and then be killed off. The developers of Poppy Playtime have made it clear that they try their best to remove characters with each new chapter to keep things fresh, but they clearly couldn't bring themselves to part with Huggy Wuggy, so it seems like he's making a return. There's absolutely no doubt that Huggy Wuggy will appear in Chapter 5. Now, of course, if Chapter 5 doesn't end up being the final chapter, Huggy Wuggy might only be shown as a prototype, but I'm almost certain they're going to reveal another part of his body that we haven't seen yet. So far, we know what his arm and legs look like, and we've even heard his creepy voice. But the question is, what other part of his body will be revealed next? What do you think it will be? Perhaps his torso, maybe his head? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Naturally, there will likely be new monsters making their debut as well. After all, where would the game be without them? Every chapter so far has introduced at least one new character, and the developers have cleverly used this to keep player interest high. People are always wondering, who is this new monster? What are its abilities, and how will it challenge us? However, there's been an issue that has arisen. Many of these new monsters were introduced early on, and now, the developers are faced with a bit of a dilemma. What do they do with them? Since so many monsters were added at the start, there's no clear path for incorporating them into future chapters or storylines. This is why the developers are working hard to try to fit them into the story and the gameplay in creative ways. However, the game still needs new characters to maintain its suspense and excitement. What do you think? What new monsters do you think will appear in Chapter 5 of Poppy Playtime? I'm really curious to know your thoughts. Be sure to write your opinion in the comments below.